Welcome to the Dance Centre podcast. I am your host, Claire French, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver, Canada. I'll be talking to dancers, choreographers and other members of the dance world here on the West Coast to find out more about their creative work and practices and to discuss what it means to us to be dance professionals today. Thanks for joining us. Anusha Fernando is a performer and teacher of the Indian classical dance form Bharata Natyam and the artistic director of Vancouver's Shakti Dance Society. She began her study of Bharata Natyam in 1990 under renowned teachers Gavinda and Jayalakshmi Eshwar. Anusha has been instrumental in the establishment of 3 Bharata Natyam organizations in Vancouver, British Columbia, the Gavinda Dance Academy, Mandala Arts and Culture Society, and Shakti Dance Society. Her work highlights the depth of Bharata Natyam's traditional repertoire as well as its interdisciplinary potential. It is important for Anusha that Bharata Natyam be a valued and influential part of the dance culture of British Columbia. Hence, she has done work with Carter West to create documents for professional dancers, juried for the BC Arts Council and Canada Council for the Arts, and continues to actively support Vancouver's next generation of Bharata Natyam artists. So I am joined by Anusha Fernando today. I'm very excited to be talking with Anusha about many things, about her company, Shakti Dance Society. I believe I'm saying that name correctly, yes. And also a new work, which is a wonderful collaborative venture for Sky Dancers, which will be happening at the Dance Centre in October. We'll be talking all about that. Anusha is a Bharata Natyam dancer and leader in the Vancouver community, and we will talk about many aspects of this and Anusha's career and history and life and current practice. Anusha, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Yeah, I'm happy to be talking with you.
Yeah, this is really lovely. We see each other quite often and say hello quite often, but we have both heard each other's facilitation talkbacks as well, which is a lovely thing that we share. I think that's really important for both of us to have this kind of engagement between the artists and the audience, and to either give a perspective or to have an audience kind of share in a perspective that maybe matches the work or complements the work in some capacity. So I'd love to, bring that in as well. But would you talk a little bit about maybe Shakti as a society and a little bit of your history, maybe weave those in as you wish?
Sure. Yeah. So Shakti Dance Society started in, I think it was 2004. And it was a pretty natural evolution, really, from having trained for a long time, actually, since the early 80s with Gavinda. We met in Montreal. I was at McGill in Montreal, and our paths crossed there. And then I moved to Vancouver to do a master's thesis here, and he ended up moving here because I was here, and he lived in the basement of my house and my family home, and that's where the Gavinda Dance Academy started, as well as the beginnings of Mandala Arts and Culture. So we lived in this very traditional training situation of teacher and student, which is often what happens in the process of Indian classical dance, where you actually live with your teacher. And so I had that wonderful opportunity with Jai and was part of his organizations for many years, but it seemed natural then for me to get my own organization, largely actually thanks to Barb Clausen. It would not have happened without Barb's support. She literally created the nonprofit for me and was just kind of very encouraging of my own voice and my own interests. And it went from there. It became something that was a production company. So we did a number of shows. It was also a training institute where I trained students and did 4 sort of traditional graduations, which is a whole process that you go through with an individual. And it was also a platform actually for bringing one of my teachers from India, Jayalakshmi Eshwar, here every summer. So she would run these summer workshops for many years and stay in my house and live with me. So it just seemed like something quite organic. And I still have a very intimate relationship with Mandala Arts and Culture and Gavinda still.
Have you ever partnered as 2 academies or 2 companies? Do you share students? Do you have is there a separation between you in terms of who the student body might be and who the performers might be, or is it a sense of community and that you kind of almost take turns in putting on the performances? I'm sure, or I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the kind of stages that a student goes through, because it's a very, very long process, extremely, kind of a devoted, kind of dedicated, of course, practice with all of these markers along the way. And is there a strong relationship there between organizations, or?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's really a kind of a lineage transmission system of training. And so when you do your kind of initial repertoire with a teacher, you are handed down music. And this is not the kind of music that you can buy in a store. It's literally from teacher to student transmission of music and repertoire. And so in some ways, yes, Jai was very kind in offering me. I learned much repertoire with him, and he allowed me to actually teach that in some senses in Shakti Dance, although I didn't do much of that teaching of his repertoire. I think he would have been okay with it just because of the nature of our relationship.
Yeah.
And I have worked a lot with supporting his students in terms of, being the MC or helping with their shows, being stage manager or tech person or lighting designer. He had me be the person who helped with his Gate to the Spirit festival. I'm helping him right now as he writes his memoir. So there's a lot of me and him have a very long and deep personal relationship, which has continued. We've had our bad times. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, your family right now as well.
But we love each other. So that's kind of there. So yeah, I feel very much a part of them, but also very different because my interests actually became quite different in some ways as well. So that's a really hard one, actually. And that was partly how this project evolved, is that how do you move from being a really good student, a dedicated student, a devoted student, which are all aspects of this form, to being an artist, actually. And sometimes this is actually a very painful process, to develop your own personal voice. The actual training system is in some ways an obliteration of personal voice. And so, there's a real process pretty much in all the Indian art forms that you kind of, the small personal self needs to kind of be extinguished for the sort of greater self to be sourced and come through, which we might call the tradition, right? But it is actually this idea that the palette that you can source from is a lot greater than the personal palette. So it involves a kind of actual doing away with the self, which includes all kinds of, very difficult taking of, you just basically have to be completely devoted to the teacher and do exactly what they say. But then it leaves you at this point when you've done years, I'm talking 20, 30 years of training with someone where you're suddenly like, you know what? I would like to say something that's particularly related to me and my experience. And that was an edge that was always really interesting for me because there was no mentorship for that.
Yeah.
And I had seen so many people go through such a hard, including myself, really difficult time with that part. And so how do you do that, right? And so that for me, and I think it's like a midlife question, right? I just got to be my age and I'm I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen, I'm one of really the first probably person who was doing a lot of stuff in Vancouver way back in the early 90s here.
Yeah.
I've seen so many dancers and I've seen this same problem occur where people get to a certain stage and it just seems very natural that they want to express something personal. And the personal comes through in the form. That's just a fact. Despite all of the rigid form of it, the personal comes through and that's what's beautiful. So, how do you support that? That really became the question. And I could identify the dancers in the community that were already asking those questions and had questions, actually. And it felt that this was a really important thing to actually engage on some level for the legacy of Bharata Natyam in the city, because I could see that people were struggling with this and that really great work was emerging from this kind of edge, So that is what Sky Dancers was essentially a process. So I applied for a creation grant from the Canada Council and the BC Arts Council to support this kind of process of bringing people into a room that were highly trained, and had deep relationships, kind of with teachers and with training things and with the actual tradition itself. And then we're kind of wanting to create work so that they kind of move from just being a Bharata Natyam dancer to an artist with Bharata Natyam training, right? Which for me is two different things entirely. And so that's what happened. It was very interesting. And we really had no agenda. It was just like, put these people into a room. For me, I really felt completely like a facilitator. Mm. I had deep relationships with all of these people. Maybe just not Ashwini Sundaram because she was kind of from a different teaching lineage. But I had been interested in her and her work and the questions, and I liked how the things that she was asking when she was presenting work. So I was looking for dancers who were thinking as well. And so we just got together in a room, and actually for the first while, it was just being together, literally doing basic technique stuff, but just how do we share space? Like, are we standing close? Are we touching? Are we going to like do things weird? Are we going to, and allowing people just to be in that sort of situation with no hierarchy. So I was not the teacher. I was just literally facilitating, holding the space for this. And that was hard for people, actually. Like, there's no teacher. What are we going to do? That also, I wanted it to be like hard on that level. Like, no one's going to really tell you what to do, what's going to come forward. And that's been super interesting. So,
yeah, I really appreciate you explaining all of this and how it came to be. I'm doing a similar thing with choreographers and dance makers in the room. So we're not actually choreographing anything or creating anything for now, but I'm interested in this kind of idea of co-creating and co-choreographing, which is very much a standard practice, I think, but maybe not articulated as such very often. And we're just at the beginning of this idea of sharing almost like choreographic practices or choreographic knowledge, but it's not even about the content. It's more aligned with what you were saying about what happens when you bring these energies and these different relationships to the form or just to a practice together in a room, and knowing that the people in the room are asking their own questions and are curious and don't feel like they have all the answers, or that by answering one question it won't raise a whole bunch of other questions, and that's how they form their work. But it's lovely to have these layers of engagement with a form, layers of engagement with the body, and be questioning how we might be behaving actually together in a room.
Exactly.
So yeah, I really appreciate that you were able to start a process that way. Yeah, could you maybe just introduce your cast? That would be lovely.
Yeah, so Kritika Ratnaswamy, actually I've known her since she was 4, since she started dancing in my basement. And, so I've literally watched her dance her whole life. So it's very, special for me actually to see what she's done and with what dedication over such a long time. Same thing with Malavika Santosh. They were literally like 3-year-olds. And I've, and now they're really at the top level of their form, and just both had sort of this star quality that I could see from the time they were just wee little girls. So those two, it's a long history, long relationships. Sujit Vaidya, me and him just have hit it off. We've done 2 duet shows together, just in terms of straight Bharatanatyam. And, he's someone I just love to talk to. He thinks a lot, and we have endless conversations. So that was an obvious choice for me. Arno Kamalika is just incredibly talented, in so many ways, really advanced musician, which is such an integral part of this form, and just a hugely creative person as well. So, they all are, and Ashwini, of course, as well, right? And I really was interested in Ashwini's kind of exploration of contemporary dance, and also all the choreography that she's doing, which is really interesting. They're all working on their own stuff. So that was also a thing, right? It wasn't just like they were coming because they had nothing to do. They're all extremely busy, and I really appreciate it. But despite being busy, they're very devoted to this project because it's something different. It's also a supportive vehicle for each other. There wasn't the pressure of a performance. Initially, I was like, let's just have this very open-ended thing, and people would come in and they would talk about their challenges. We'd spent a lot of time actually debriefing personally, which is completely not in the way of our training, you know, where people
Mm.
would say, this is what I'm going through, these are my challenges, and they would be heard and supported by this group. And in fact, there was kind of a fear that this would ever come to an end in the group because it became kind of integral for all of us in our artistic work to have this kind of supportive field, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's something about the having a space where you feel like you can voice things that are happening for you that are very close to your practice, but that maybe nobody else would understand what that proximity is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is such a special place, and we need it more than ever.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like, oh, maybe that's just my age talking, as well. But I feel like,
Yeah.
for well-being as artists, and to continue to value what it is we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, Arnaud gave birth to a child just
Yeah,
at the beginning of this process, and I'm a mother. You know, my daughter's
yeah,
25 now. So,
yeah,
you know, just that simple connection that we had, you know, I wrote in childcare into my grant for her. So, you
yeah,
know, those kind of things are really important. That made a big difference to her to sort of be understood on the level of the challenges of being a mother, trying to be a dancer. So, yeah, these are things that are important actually. And both in developing relationships, but in developing the work, actually, it became kind of an integral part of her piece, which is interesting.
yeah. I feel like this fits in quite well with this, but there's back at the beginning when you were talking about the relationship between the student and teacher, and that when the student reaches a certain point where they want to express their own personal, I wonder if that's also a point at which a teacher has arrived at when they decide that they are ready or wanting to continue to pass on the lineage as a teacher. Or
Mm-hmm.
is there a tradition that it is more likely that you will become a teacher than you will a performer if you are in traditional training? Or is it not necessarily one or the other?
Yeah, I
Like,
don't know. I mean, see, in this group itself, I think there are some people that aren't interested at all in teaching the form. They're very much
yeah,
just in creating work.
yeah,
And there are others that are very interested in teaching. I think it's, you know, what happens, that tension, I think, is just this feeling that, you know, I want to start making more choices on my own. I want to decide, you know, because traditional training is extremely hierarchical. It's like you don't even get to choose the pieces often that you're going to do. It's the teacher, you know, and it's really all about, you know, the teacher is very big in your mind. So there's a lot about perfectionism and about, you know, just doing it right and constant critique. And so I think at some point it becomes like, you know what, I kind of like to choose what I'm going to spend like 2 years working on, or I would like to not just have this voice of perfection. Like I really just wanted a voice of process, really, where so the whole thing here was also so interesting because in Indian classical dance, it's often that you will get a piece, you will consolidate immediately, and then you will practice and practice and practice, you know? So it's just like so embodied that there's no thought at all, and you're dancing long hours of vocab, you know, it's a classical form. But
yeah,
this was so interesting because we would build things and just throw them away continuously, which was
yeah,
really unnerving for me. And it was really good to look at. I was like, oh my God, you know, and it's like, and then we got the production grant and I was like, oh my God, we need to consolidate, you know, I need to consolidate. I need to have a show.
yeah,
But it's really been interesting just taking it right to the edge of just continuously throwing it away and seeing what emerges. And frankly, it's been really astonishing to me that, you know,
yeah.
better stuff just keeps coming up, and it's just more, you know, that we can even do that is like a big step for all of us in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure that is like, the level of expertise to even know what it is that things are folded into your next iteration.
Yeah,
Like there are things that while you're throwing things away, you are actually deepening things
exactly.
that you found there. And that's the beauty of thinking of it as throwing away, because you're diving in, or
Mhm.
you're kind of layering those things. And that's the conversation you're having at that level
Yeah,
with your collaborators.
yeah.
Could we talk a little bit about your other collaborators too? So obviously dance and music are so, and rhythm and, sound and quality is so inextricable
Mm-hmm.
in traditional Indian form, and in many things that I really love. How is the collaboration working with your musicians and with there's a word that you use. Is it chanters? Is
Yes.
that the word you use for?
Yeah.
Could you explain that too? I love that word. I'm curious about that. So
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah, so the pieces, I mean, maybe I'll say a bit about what the piece is. So, because we had all this beautiful creative exploration with this group, at some point I thought, well, I need some framework to actually hang this process on. And I'm quite interested in stories and mythology and whatnot. And so in my readings over time, I had come across this character in the Indian tradition that kind of gets developed in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition called a Dakini, or a sky dancer. And I was reading this book, and she's an interesting character because in her mythology, she holds this interesting interplay that I'm very interested in, which is both the connection between movement and stillness. So she's seen as flying in the sky, but she's also this teacher of meditators. So she comes to them in their spiritual practice of stillness and kind of helps guide them to liberation. It's this sort of mythology, which seemed to me to be exactly what Bharata Natyam is about in some ways. And then I had read this really interesting sort of scholarly manuscript where this person had done translations of what are called the songs of the Dakinis. And they had these wonderful names, and I'll just say them because they would just like capture my whole piece. So it's Blissful Diamond, Tree Leaf, Wings of Breath, Corpse Raising, and Lion Faced. And so that immediately was just like sketched out. So it gave me like 5 pots to actually put some of this choreographic material that was arising in studio into. And it was really obvious for me to see actually who would lead these 5 pieces just by these 5 titles. And which is really interesting because this kind of, the Dakini is really about the dynamic energy in the universe. So all these different expressions of energy. And so each piece has kind of a different expression of energy and is led by a particular dancer. And so the musicians, in some ways, we use some recorded music, and then we're using some kind of live musical support. And it's not a Bharata Natyam band by any way. I'm using a shakuhachi player, so that's more because of the breath stuff that he can do, and some melodic stuff. And I'm using a percussionist who is a mridangist, who does play the South Indian classical drum, but probably won't be playing that percussion. The dancers are doing a lot of sounding and percussing and stuff in my piece. So it's very non-traditional in terms of its instrumentation. And also they are sitting in the line. So on the stage is actually set up like what's called a zendo, a meditation hall. So it's going to have 8 people on stage that are just sitting in stillness through the piece. And 2 of them are the musicians, because they're both musicians who are actually engaged in spiritual forms, so and they're quite comfortable playing on the ground. So whatever they do is going to be from these cushions on the ground. And these meditators are also chanting, so there's traditional chants that are going on. So it's a piece that really is about kind of things arising and things disappearing, the kind of play of our lives. And in between that, there are these pauses. So the stillness part is important in this piece. The pauses are important. And so right now, we'll see. We're going in August for 2 weeks, and we're kind of hooking up all the puzzle pieces. So we'll see how all that falls. But yeah, it's interesting. And it's very interesting, like the feeling that the people who are sitting still have to have dancers moving around them. And then the dancers, how they're sourcing the presence of the people on stage. And because the form, like Bharata Natyam, is very much about stillness and present. And of course, when you sit in meditation, there's a lot of movement. So, making those connections really was important for me, because those are practices in my own life. So, yeah,
that's wonderful. And also, there is something about I always feel this in an audience. I'm always kind of self-aware in an audience situation, and sometimes I'm so responsive sometimes to what I'm watching. That's been my practice as an audience member. I feel like that's a big part of my practice, is being an audience member as well. And then suddenly, the audience and the people on the stage who are in a similar, not quite the same state necessarily, but there is a kind of connection there, isn't there, between the people watching
Yes.
and the stillness, in fact, and also an awareness of how much movement maybe one does as an audience member or doesn't, or their neighbor,
Exactly.
which
That's
is,
a
yeah.
great point. Yeah. I mean, I think of it more like we're facilitating kind of a ritual gathering as opposed to like a performative piece. And that was really important for me to kind of have this sense of an experience that we're creating,
Yeah.
which includes, say, the audience. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in the description of it, current, which may change,
Yeah.
but of the work, but I like that you say the dynamic play of energy in the universe, and that the choreography expresses both the dancer's personal voices and the rich traditions and meditative practices that have emerged from India. And I feel like the way in which this is going to be presented is going to have this lovely fluid kind of sensibility of, as you were saying, like a personal expression of a form, but completely rooted in these traditional forms. This is how you've come together, and this is this is the thread,
Yeah.
between the pieces, which is really lovely. And the stories that you've, found to,
Yeah.
the analogies that you're creating. I think that's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Are you in it?
No, it's the first.
No. Okay.
Actually, that's also been super interesting.
Yeah.
So I felt a sadness around that, which is kind of interesting recently. As the thing is, I've never created a piece actually that I've not danced in, and so
How
it was just
exciting.
this feeling of actually needing to be kind of outside or supportive or continue the facilitation, not end that seems somehow really important. So, and just the letting go, because it's good to see actually how much I'm wanting to control things, and so just allow myself to be like, okay, just be offering this on some level. So no,
Yeah.
not in the piece. Yeah.
But I think there's something very interesting about all of the different ways in which you can contribute from that place,
Exactly.
from a place of, because you're absolutely obviously integral to the work, and so that's a beautiful thing that you can kind of maintain this sense of contribution,
Mm-hmm.
and also of the overarching, kind of story and production as well. I think that's really interesting. I would like to come back though to some of your performances,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your collaborative work with maybe other disciplines. Doesn't really matter, but just a little bit around collaboration and as a performer, and anything you'd like to share about that and those experiences.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of my interdisciplinary work actually started because there weren't Carnatic musicians here to support traditional Bharata Natyam back in the early 90s. It's changed. And so because of actually scarcity of resources, I just started to work actually with musicians from other forms. And it was always interesting to me, as I said, stories. I've actually been like the book buyer at Banyan Books for close to 30 years. So the whole other part of my life is actually writing and reading, and that's an interest of mine. And so it was pretty natural that for me that I actually kind of enjoyed the idea of actually bringing storytellers or actors and stuff into Bharatanatyam being such a storied form, that to kind of make it explicit. And I think partly in those days we were trying to also make it accessible and understandable. Unfortunately, people's careers were defined by stuff like that back then. It's like, oh, you gotta figure out how to make these audiences appreciate what you do by making it accessible.
Yeah.
And I was definitely part of that stream. It's nice that that's not such a weighty thing anymore, frankly, but it was. And so I did a lot of interesting projects. And one of them was actually really inspired by Vancouver Moving Theatre. I was the dancer in their Tales from the Ramayana, which was a huge success. It was like 12 sold out nights at the Roundhouse completely. And it was an interdisciplinary performance that included Adrian Wong, who was the storyteller, and it was amazing. Like we just had so much fun doing that, shadow puppets and different musicians, and I really thrived in that kind of a thing. And so I realized like, oh, this is an interest of mine to create this kind of interdisciplinary work, working with artists from other fields, other disciplines. And so, that actually a lot of my work had that. Even my traditional margams, which are traditional Bharatanatyam performances, had often kind of thematic things to them, or I would do kind of interpretations before the dance piece. Or I always felt like I wanted to bring some writing in or something like that. I wanted to talk about the pieces in different ways. There's very like traditional ways of talking about the pieces, and I always felt like, why do we always talk about it this way? You know, that was always the question for me, like, why can't we talk about it another way? I see it another way, you know? And so that's always been kind of a thing for me that's driven a lot of stuff.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
So you have a writing stream in
Yes.
your life. Is it a writing career for you? Do you have
Not at all, but you know, it was one of those things when I was very little. It was like, I'm going to be a writer, and I love writing, and I love reading, and you know, so that's just continued, you know, the whole literary thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and are you including your own writings in the show?
You know, this is interesting because before each piece, there were these songs that are sung by the Dakinis, and there's sort of these pith statements about the sky and the mind like the sky. This is kind of the underlying theme. And it was very funny. I was in the theater with Cheng Yan, and we were so I had written out kind of how they were written. But when we tried to project it on the fabric, the words wouldn't fit. And this is the perfect thing, right, with artistic creation, because it was like, oh gosh, I have to rewrite this now, and I can only use 8 characters. And so I had a lot of fun actually rewriting these things into these kind of pith statements that could only have so many words. And frankly, it's better now, you know, which is really interesting, like how that works. Mm-hmm. So there is this kind of writing part of this project for me. You know, I often like words just, you know, as kind of helping to frame things in some ways. So
yeah. And that's your facilitation skill as well, I think, and your connection with and your discussion, leading discussion skill of bringing these things, realizing these things, or actualizing perspective for people in words, that can still allow for, you know, their imaginations and their own resonances to come to the fore. I think that's really beautiful. So the process of rewriting, do you think that's also, and resources again, you know, kind of requiring it, you know, like, so it's so lovely that kind of this is how it's going to be presented to an audience, and therefore, this is this is the way that we want to be able to share this projection. This is what will have to fit. And it sounds like, you know, like the number of characters you can use, but that's also very much of a contemporary production or a contemporary presentation. So would you say, I know that you believe and that Bharata Natyam is an evolving art form, and so many of these cultural forms need this. We need to understand that this is the case. There are the traditions and the lineage, because they are evolving and emerging and relying on people taking them in new directions. So where is Bharata Natyam now as a contemporary art form? Do we know, like, is it the same everywhere in the world, do you think, of how Bharata Natyam has evolved? Or do you think what does the evolution of Bharata Natyam look like? What does the contemporary Bharata Natyam, how might you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is this thing called Bharata Natyam that we train in, and it's you know, there's certain codified things about it, but really there's no static thing called Bharata Natyam, and it's essentially evolving just as people are evolving. And I think that is really, and it's just a form of training, you know, that people use as a tool to express their lives. And so that's always been like a thing for me, is the importance of recognizing that it's not the definition of our artistry, you know, that we're not bound by, you know, because it's so easy for us to just become these cultural products. And for me, part of this piece was this need to show people that actually Bharata Natyam dancers are very different. And you'll see that each piece has kind of an entrance by these 5 dancers, and you'll see how different each of these entrances are. I mean, these dancers are all trained in sort of certain kinds of similar trainings, but, you know, they are just using the tools to actually express themselves as artists. I think that's really important. And people keep kind of referencing the other part that kind of bothers me is it's often just continuously always related to India. You know, it's like we're doing something from India. Like, frankly, many of these people are born here, grew up here. They're Canadian. They're even just British Columbian. and they're doing stuff right here, right now, according to their lives as it manifests in this moment. And so, kind of getting out of the trap of just being caught in that view as well, by the dance community, which is, understandable in some ways, because perhaps, there has been ways of presenting that just seem to reiterate a cultural form. And I think that that's partly what I'm trying to encourage, is that people come forward. It's an extremely rich tradition, asking all kinds of interesting questions about life that are relevant to all of us. And people figure out how to talk about it, right? This is really what we need to be trained in. And I think it's happening, certainly people are doing that. But they would all say, all these artists would say, yeah, we're Bharata Natyam trained dancers, but, that doesn't define the expression that is coming out of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like this is a really beautiful artistic arena to be in, and a topic of conversation, because I don't want to use the wrong words here, but I probably will. So I'll just say them because I'm being honest. But there is an access reference here. There's an access to a form, and but there's also, I've discovered tap dancing again in my life, and there's a lot of, how far I can go in tap dancing really depends on how far I commit to it. And in order to commit to it, I have to let other things maybe go for a while so that I can really build up my skill and really understand its culture, understand its roots, understand its origins, have a real sense for myself of what it means for me to be doing it and what it means in my artistic life. And then I would just say that there is the access point to particular types of dance, I think, is really crucial here, isn't it? Because you find out about art forms, and then you find there's an affinity with certain art forms, or there's something that where you feel like it has a personal connection to you, it has a personal resonance, and we have to find ways to relate to that differently, to it being a cultural connection. I think that's what you're saying partly here. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because way back when me and Jai used to do solo performances, we didn't even think about actually really explaining our pieces. And I used to dance and just do like straight out hour and a half Bharatanatyam solos, and with no explanation. And people would be deeply touched actually by the form. And in fact, words seem sort of irrelevant, but the question was actually like, what was it that was moved in them? And that's often been my question, like, what is it that's moving about this form? And often the words that we put are actually, they're not good enough. You know what I mean? They're too small actually for the experience that's occurring.
Yeah.
Such a rich form, and something is being transmitted between the audience. Something is touched. Something feels, as you say, very personal to you, even though, it's this person dressed in this costume that doesn't look anything like me, but something personal is happening. And for me, that's a huge question for me. Like, what is going on here, between us? And how can I bring that forward, that there is something going on here? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's also this connection to form as well, to being open to what a form might be able to teach us, or how a form is a way of connecting with the world that essentially is just a vehicle for connecting to the world and connecting to others.
Exactly, right? Yeah. I mean, really, it's like some very fundamental human situation, right? That we're all involved in, and that we all want, and that our hearts want, and that we're all exactly at the basis. There's just different ways of expressing that or doing that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the moment that it happens is kind of pre-words, or like something happens and then we either analyze it or reflect on it, or we have the after effect of then communicating it. But that's not the thing.
Exactly.
It's already been communicated. It's already done its work. So, yeah. So that's wonderful. I know you have a background in religious studies. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Are you doing anything with that right now? Which is not what I want to say, but yeah, how does that work with you?
I have a BA from McGill University. That's where I met Jai, and that's actually, it was funny. I was watching a video in a class called Images of the Feminine in Hinduism and Buddhism, and a Bharata Natyam dancer just appeared in the class, like on a video. And I had this really weird sensation, like, wow, I could do that, which was hilarious because I was not even like a physical person. It was just this weird experience. And then I ended up actually hooking up with Jai. So that's how my whole thing started, is actually seeing this form and just being touched in some kind of inexplicable way. And then I had no idea who was good, who was bad in Canada. And I just ended up being one of his first private students. So
wow.
I could have picked anyone. And so, it's just these mysteries of life. So yes, I started and I obviously had these questions, these sort of big existential questions that Bharatanatyam is actually all about. So it worked really well to kind of be in a form that is very overtly a spiritual form, right? So that was very interesting to me. And then I did a master's degree at UBC in Sanskrit, which is, one of the base languages for a lot of the dance material. Mm-hmm. So, my academic life did not continue, but all of the training was actually helpful. You know how it is, right? It's like everything that you do is like somehow useful in the moment. It's like, oh, okay, well, I don't know.
I know. And I think this is back to the personal expression, or like what your life is, right? I know that my academic background, it feeds my conversations, it feeds my work to a certain degree, but I don't want an academic career right now.
Yeah.
I just feel like that wouldn't be the right place for my curiosity, for the things that I want to. I just don't feel like it's me, but I'm extremely grateful for the fact that I've been able to access that, and that I have my PhD and I have all of those things, and the time that it gave me to invest in certain kind of curiosities, or even the people I met and the other perspectives that I had to know about. Exactly. I might not have cared about them had I not been forced into reading other people, just because of the nature of being curious about the world myself. Like there's a real grounding there, and there's a real kind of respect of line of questioning, curiosity, and perspective, and time. Exactly. Like patience as well. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if we could talk maybe just a little bit to bring this maybe to a close, or anything else you'd like to raise. I'm happy for you to bring that in here. But we know what you're working on now, and be really interested to know what's happening next, or at the same time around for you, and maybe a little bit about what you would, kind of where you'd like to see the Bharatanatyam form, or what you would like to do, or what you would like the community, how you would like the community to think of it, our listeners to be thinking about around what we've talked about as a cultural form, but also expanding on that a little bit. Yeah, so maybe something around what's happening for you now and what's next.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is just the beginning of something. It feels like for me it's the beginning, and there's just been a lot of like excitement in this community, and I feel like we could include, there's a number of other people I feel that could have been in this project. So for me, I'm hoping, I feel like the Dance Center is pretty much behind this. They've been very supportive of Bharatanatyam training in a sort of school format, but we're looking for things outside of dance schools. How is this community going to function outside of dance schools? That's interesting to me. How are dancers from different dance schools going to function together in the same room? And those kinds of questions, and what comes out of that kind of discussion. I think this is something that's absolutely essential for our community, and I'm hoping that the Dance Center will support this going forward. I think that they probably will in some fashion. And what the work that comes out of this, I mean, a lot of interesting work has been sparked actually by associations in this group already, not necessarily with me, but with, just facilitating relationships between artists. So I think that that's what's going to happen. I think that there's going to be a creative Bharatanatyam scene actually in Vancouver, led by dancers who are just exploding actually to be creative. Yeah. And there will be a very strong, school training thing happening parallel, but they're not the same thing. They've often been conflated, and for me, it's like, I want to disengage that on some level.
Yeah. I love that, because I feel like I'm with you, but I feel like I'm trying to fill a gap between the kind of, well, for choreographers, I believe there is a little bit of a void in choreographers being able to find a training without dancers in front of them waiting for them to tell them what to do or to give them things to do. And so there are lots of other things that choreographers are doing outside of giving dancers steps. And so that we need some kind of honing of our practice in those areas in a less pressurized and time pressured environment, and less like emotionally sensitive or vulnerable place.
Yes.
But still being able to be vulnerable and open and explorative and experimental, just without the same stakes for the actual work itself or a professionalized, environment. So, but I see that very much as a part of a professional practice and training. So I feel like, while in some ways that might sound like it's about closing a gap, I think it is also making a separation between certain forms of training or becoming good at something and then suddenly creating work from that place. There is that space between.
Yeah, that's a nice way.
Yeah, and I think you're in that same zone, which requires us to be facilitators of other people's journeys and experience.
It's so interesting, like the power of just relationship and care. That's been super interesting for me, is just, it's like to bear witness to another human being.
Absolutely.
And then just see what comes forward, which is, as you say, it's not about learning steps at that point. It's about something else. And so,
and it's about being seen by your peers.
Exactly. Yeah.
And heard, and, and sharing with your peers, which I think is a very important space for us to be kind of creating and refining in this community. So thank you for all your work. It's just wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are many other things we could talk about, but we'll save it for next time. For the continuation of this project and everything. Yeah. I wish you so much luck for the rest of your process, and it'd be so wonderful to see the show. And I love your collaborators so much. I was able to work with some of them in slightly different capacities, but with the Nova Dance project, and then Sujit working with us a tiny bit. So I feel like there's a little bit of lovely crossover. It feels so special, and I hope we continue to do that in this community more and more. So,
great. Well, thank you very much, Claire. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anusha. Thank you. Bye for now. Thank you so much for listening. We would love for you to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts, as this will help other listeners find us and help us to grow our dance audience. We'll be back next month. In the meantime, you can follow us on Facebook at The Dance Centre, Twitter at Dance Centre, and Instagram at The Dance Centre BC. And if you'd like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Just go to our website at thedancecentre.ca, where you'll find extensive information about our upcoming programs and events. The music for the Dance Centre podcast was composed by James B. Maxwell. Always a pleasure to connect with you through dance. Until next time.